Okay, let's go in and add in the optional parameters now. And I'll go 380. That's about where we were. That's lucky. That's right at the print statement. And since this is a dictionary, I can tell if this key is in the dictionary with just if, what do we want? Secured severity ID. In dict. If it's in there, then we want to use whatever they sent as input. We could actually do range checking on at this point, make certain it's a reasonable value, but we're just going to go with just using it. Equals dict sub severity ID. And remember, we've got to put in a sub-0 here. Else, we want to take the severity ID, and if we look at the data, we just want 1 for the ID of 1. So if we look at issue list view, that was not what I wanted. The ref tables for severity. Here's the data, and ID1 is unknown, which would be an appropriate default for this. When we do state, 1 is created. So that is what we want in our as a default. And I think I will add a comment that I know that that is a severity of 1 that I'm putting in. And that takes care of one of them. I think we also ought to do state. But while we're at it here, I'm going to do a printout and make certain that I am getting the right kind of a value. So I've added to the printout. I'm just going to actually copy that little section of 4 lines, 5 lines, and do it for these others. But this gives us the opportunity of testing this and making certain that we're getting the right values. And we'll pop over here. And the other one is the question of issue ID. They could send in an issue ID. We could generate one. We could let the database generate it. If we let the database generate it, then we've got to ask the database what it generated when we do an insert statement. It seems simpler to me to actually just generate it. So let's deal with state ID. And I typed something wrong. Okay, so we've got an issue ID, but we definitely don't want to generate it as a 1. We want to generate that from our function that generates ID. So we want gen UUID in the code as our default. And that's our issue ID. We're getting close to the point where we can actually do an insert statement, since we should have all of the values at this point when we call it this time. And the last one is this comment is now inaccurate. That's created. Okay, let's run this once and test it. Again, Control-C, and I'll just bring that back. And guess what? I left off some colons. And there we go. We're ready to give this a test. This time, let's just test it again with demo 1 and the same body. It should fill in the other values. And we see that we got a severity ID of 1. So basically that code looks like it's probably working. We could go in here and we could do and ID equals 3. And over here in my results, I got severity ID 3. So probably my code is doing what it's supposed to. Let's go and edit this and add in the insert statement. That's not what I wanted. I wanted VI. There we go. Edit it. About line 390. Now, as soon as we want to do the insert statement, we're making a change to the database. Database it's going to run inside a transaction so that we can bulk up a bunch of changes, and when we get done with all those changes, we have to commit it. Now, a transaction means that if we got some sort of an error in the middle, we could roll it back and just throw away all those changes, and nobody ever saw them. But since we're in a transaction, if we want that change to actually take effect in the database, we're going to have the database's interface and say at the end, I want to commit it. So the first part of that is global. Oh, I mistyped global. dbconn, which we have to have down here at the bottom right after we do an insert. That in Python says, go out and get this global where I connected to the database and use it in here instead of creating a new variable. And then we want to run an insert. We have a function that actually runs an insert called run insert. And it takes a string, which is the select statement, with some parameters that are bind variables. So insert into issue. And an insert has the columns. So ID, title, body, severity ID. Severity ID, state ID, and what else? I think that's it. Severity ID, state ID, yes, that is it. And then the values, we want to have the parameters that we're going to pass, which we're going to set it up with a list of named parameters. So the first one of those is, and the way we do it in Python is with this %, paren, and a name. It's issue ID. It's really important for security reasons that you use bind values. If you insert or you substitute data into the select statement itself, that allows for SQL injection. So what we want to do is we want to use parameters for each of these. This is a string, so we want to tell it what the data type is and how it's supposed to use the bind parameters. If you use some other language like Go or, Java, generally speaking, the bind parameters are just positional, like $1, $2, $3. But in Python, they've done a nice thing where we have name substitution, which makes it even more convenient. And that was the ID. And title. That's also a string, so it knows to quote it when it puts it in here, that it's going to process it as a string. And then we want to have a body. I put a $sign instead of a %sign. And we want the severity ID. And interestingly enough, these are also strings because we're generating and pulling them off those parameters as strings. Again, it would be worthwhile doing checking to verify that it's actually an integer value. I have not done that in here. Severity ID. And the severity ID, and what's the last one? Is state ID. And I have put in another $sign instead of a %sign. Look at that. And then comma, and then we send in a dictionary of named parameters with title, body, let's see, body, that's supposed to be a colon, issue ID, severity ID, state ID, and state ID, and a close paren to close off the parentheses for the parameters here, And let me look at it for a second and see if I have introduced something bad. I have. Look at that. That body is supposed to be the variable on that side. That would have caused us to just insert bodies of body. That's not what we want. Severity ID, state ID, something like that. Now, right after we do the insert, we're actually done. We don't have more than one command that we're running with the database, which means we want to do dbcon.commit. Okay. And at that point, we actually have the results from this run insert, which is what we want to return as the value back to the client, back to the user, with success, status, that kind of information. So that S that I created, that string, is what we're going to return as the JSON response to doing the insert. All right, I think we're ready to rerun the server with those modifications, and let's crank it up. And let's test this. And this time we should actually get something in the database. So we started the server, and let's go back and run our wget with a title and a body and a severity ID of 3. And it runs, it produces some sort of output. Over here looking at the server, I got a 200, which is reasonably promising. And I've still got this extra print statement in here that we probably want to delete at this point. But we can see that we got a severity ID of 3. And now that I've actually run it, the question is, of course, did I actually get data in the database? So let's go over here on my database server. And I'll go into PSQL, and I want to select title from iIssue. And that looks promising. I have a title in there of a title and 6 rows, which means that I actually created an API that inserted into the database, and I can see the results. So between seeing, the 200 over here coming back from the server, and the fact that I'm actually seeing the data that I'm kind of expecting inside the database, this looks reasonably promising. I mean, this isn't a full-fledged test, but it's enough to say, let's see what we got. Dot out. We should have saved a couple files. This is in the wrong direction. Let's go over here where we are. It's demo.out. And unfortunately, I have done this, but I have not gotten back the ID to the front end. I am doing something wrong there, but at least I got back a message that it was an error and I didn't have an ID. But, it's getting closer. Let's go figure out what's wrong with the message and what we're expecting there. Okay, I actually had a typo in the stuff. I fixed that, and I'm running it. Now let's take a look at demo.out, and there is our result with our ID and our generated UUID returned to the front end, which is what we'd like to see for an insert. And we've got the data actually stored in the front end. Here's the final code with the typo removed. It's right around line 400. I actually had to have that be called ID to match with the column right there. It was not good to mismatch my column names. So I took that out, and there it is. We have data in the database and a successful status being returned by our run insert. So this is kind of the implementation for this piece. We have not looked at how we deal with post parameters, but I think we're going to find that that is very easy because it is dealt with already for us. But let's go take a look at that next.